It was a suffocating October afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, when Steph Curry made a stop that would change two lives forever. You can see that sometimes the most important moments happen when we least expect them, disguised as coincidences that are actually cosmic reunions with our own past. Steph was returning from a photo shoot for his sneaker line at a studio in downtown Charlotte. The day had been long, full of repetitive takes and forced smiles, but he always felt a special satisfaction when working in his hometown. Charlotte wasn't just where he was born, it was where his first dreams were planted by people who believed in him before he even believed in himself. Traffic was heavy on West Trade Street, and Steph stopped the car at the red light, taking the opportunity to respond to some messages on his phone. It was in that moment of casual distraction that something caught his peripheral attention. Something that made his heart stop for an instant and then race, as if he were at the free throw line of an NBA final. On the sidewalk, sitting in a broken plastic chair under the sparse shade of a small awning, was a woman with silver hair wearing a faded floral dress. In her small, wrinkled hands, she held a cardboard sign with a message written in shaky handwriting. Retired teacher. 40 years of service. Any help is a blessing. How is it possible that a single image can instantly transport our mind to a classroom from decades ago? Steph felt as if he had been struck by lightning of memories that exploded simultaneously in his consciousness. Without thinking twice, Steph parked the car irregularly in the first spot he found and walked quickly toward the woman. With each step, certainty grew within him like a wave that gains strength as it approaches the shore. That face, even marked by time and hardships, was unmistakable. "Excuse me, ma'am," Steph said softly, crouching in front of the chair to be at eye level with her. Are you Professor Sarah Mitchell?" The woman slowly raised her eyes, and Steph could see in them a mixture of confusion, surprise, and that deep fatigue that comes from years carrying weights too heavy for delicate shoulders. For a moment, that seemed eternal. The two looked at each other in silence, as if the universe were processing the impossibility of that encounter. "Steph?" The voice came out almost like an incredulous whisper. "Steph Curry? My little Steph, who wanted to touch the stars? Have you ever wondered what it must be like to reunite with someone who was fundamental in shaping your most primary dreams?" In that moment, Steph wasn't an NBA star or a global icon. He was once again that 8-year-old boy who sat in the front row of Professor Sarah's classroom, absorbing every word as if they were magic seeds. "Yes, it's me, Professor Sarah," Steph replied, his voice choked with emotion he couldn't hide. "I can't believe it's you. What are you doing here?" Sarah Mitchell had been a third-grade teacher at Oaklawn Elementary School during Steph's most formative years. But she was much more than that. She was that rare type of educator who could see giant potential in small children, who planted dreams where others saw only physical limitations. "Steph, my dear boy," Sarah said, and for the first time in months, a genuine smile lit up her tired face. "Look how you've grown, in every sense. I remember when you told me you were going to play in the NBA, and everyone laughed because you were the smallest in the class. Something that touches deeply is how certain people leave such deep marks in our lives that even decades later, a simple reunion can instantly reconnect us with who we were and with the dreams they helped us form." For Steph, being in front of Professor Sarah was like finding the original source of his self-confidence. "Professor," Steph said, sitting on the sidewalk floor next to her, completely oblivious to the people who were beginning to recognize him and take photos. "Do you remember the Big Dreams, Bigger Hearts project?" Sarah smiled with that type of smile that special teachers reserve for their most precious memories. How could I forget? You were so small, so shy. But when you talked about basketball, your eyes shone like two stars. The Big Dreams, Bigger Hearts had been a project that Sarah created specifically for Steph and other children in the class who faced mockery for having dreams that were too big for their circumstances. It was an extra hour after classes where she worked not only on academic subjects, but on self-esteem and future visualization. I still remember the first time you told me that body size doesn't determine dream size, Steph continued, his own words surprising him with the clarity of the memory. You said I had special fire in my eyes, and that this fire was more important than height. Naturally, this leads us to understand how first teachers are fundamental in not only intellectual formation, but emotional formation of a child. Sarah had identified and nurtured the flame of ambition in Steph at an age when that flame was still fragile enough to be extinguished by mockery and doubts. "But, Professor Sarah," Steph said, his voice carrying genuine concern, "what happened? How did you end up here?" Sarah sighed deeply, like someone who carries a long and painful story. "Life, my dear. Life happened. When schools started cutting programs in 2010, older teachers like me were the first to be dismissed. I tried to find another job, but, well, at 54, it wasn't easy to start over. What's most impressive is how destiny can be cruelly ironic. While Steph had become one of the most recognized athletes in the world, the woman who had planted the first seeds of his self-confidence and determination was struggling to survive on the streets of the same city where both had shared magical moments of learning and growth. I lost my house 3 years ago, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining an impressive dignity, even narrating her fall. Health problems consumed my savings, and here I am, at 67, discovering that society doesn't value as much the 40 years I dedicated to education. How is it possible that a society allows people who dedicated their lives to forming future generations to end up in situations of such vulnerability? Steph felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and a growing determination he hadn't felt since his first NBA seasons. "But enough talking about me," Sarah said, quickly changing the subject with that typical deflection of proud people who don't want to be seen as objects of pity. "Tell me about you. I watch all your games on the library television. 4 championships, 2 Olympic medals. I'm so proud of my boy." You can see that even living on the street, even facing unimaginable difficulties, Sarah had maintained that unconditional and genuine love that characterizes great educators. She still referred to Steph as "my boy" with the same maternal affection she had demonstrated decades before. Steph felt a lump in his throat that threatened to turn into tears. There was the woman who had been the first person to truly believe in his impossible dreams, the first to say he could be special when everyone else saw only a small and shy child. And she was living a reality that challenged any notion of justice in the world. "Professor Sarah," Steph said, his voice trembling with emotion, "do you remember what you taught me about dreaming big?" Sarah nodded, her eyes lighting up with the memory. "That dreams have no size when you have someone who believes in you." "Exactly," Steph replied, and in that moment, a determination began to crystallize within him. A determination that went far beyond simply helping with money or a meal. It was something bigger, something that would honor not only the teacher's present need, but all the transformative influence she had exercised in his life. "Professor," Steph continued, "I need to go now, but would you be willing to talk with me tomorrow?" I have a proposal I'd like to make. A proposal that I think will very much interest the woman who taught an entire class to dream big. Something that touches deeply is how some people enter our lives exactly when we need them most, plant essential seeds, and then the universe conspires for us to reunite with these people when we have the capacity to adequately reciprocate all the influence they exercised. Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if she didn't know whether she should accept any type of additional involvement. There was pride in those tired eyes, the same pride that had made her a respected and beloved teacher for hundreds of students over 4 decades. "Steph, she began, but he gently interrupted her. "Please, Professor, it's not charity. It's an opportunity. You taught me that dreams have no size when we have someone who believes. Now, let me be that person who believes in you. How is it possible that words we once used to encourage others can return to us transformed into a source of our own hope?" Sarah could hear echoes of her own lessons being reflected back by that boy who had become a man, but who still carried the essence of that curious and determined student. Sarah slowly nodded, and Steph could see a small spark of hope lighting up in the teacher's eyes. It was the same spark she had lit in him years ago, when Steph was just a child with dreams too big for his physical size, but with an even bigger heart. "I'll meet you here tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon, Steph said, gently touching the teacher's hand. "And Professor Sarah, thank you for planting the first dream in me. Now it's my turn to plant some dreams in you." Naturally, this leads us to understand that true gratitude doesn't age or diminish with time. Steph had carried Sarah Mitchell's first lessons of self-esteem and ambition throughout his entire career, and now had the opportunity to transform this lasting gratitude into concrete action. As he walked back to his car, Steph knew that his life had changed again that afternoon. Not because he had found an old teacher, but because he had reunited with the original source of his self-confidence. The first person who had looked at an 8-year-old child and seen not his limitations, but his infinite potential. That night, Steph couldn't sleep. His mind was bubbling with memories from 3rd grade, with Professor Sarah's gentle face, with ambitious plans that were beginning to take shape. Sarah Mitchell had planted the first seed of his dreams when he was only 8 years old. Now, at 35, it was time for Steph to plant some seeds in her life. But first, he needed to remember exactly how that extraordinary woman had changed his life forever when he was still just a small child with giant dreams. To understand the true impact of the reunion on West Trade Street, we need to go back 26 years in time, to a small classroom at Oaklawn Elementary School in 1997. It was there that a skinny 8-year-old boy named Steph Curry was facing his first lessons about mockery, impossible dreams, and the transformative power of having someone who believes in you. You can see that some teachers mark our lives not by what they teach in textbooks, but by the self-esteem lessons they share when we're too small to understand their value, but old enough to absorb them as fundamental truths. Sarah Mitchell was exactly that type of educator, one who saw giants where others saw only small children. Steph was in the middle of 3rd grade, measuring only 4 feet 2 inches, 1.27 meters, and weighing little more than 27 kilograms. While his classmates seemed to grow every month, he remained the smallest in the class, scrawny, and constantly being reminded by other children that his dreams were too big for his size. "I remember perfectly the first day that changed everything," Steph had said years later. "It was a Monday in March. I had just been chosen last again for a team at recess, and I was sitting alone in the corner of Professor Sarah's classroom during break, trying not to cry in front of the others. Sarah Mitchell was organizing materials at her desk when she noticed Steph sitting alone, with that unmistakable body language of a child who was carrying emotional pain too heavy for such small shoulders. As an educator for more than 15 years, she had developed a special radar for detecting when a child was going through crucial moments of self-esteem formation. "Steph," Sarah said softly, putting the papers aside and walking to where he was sitting. "May I sit here with you for a minute?" How is it possible that a simple question asked in the right tone can open the heart of a child who was closing himself to the world? Steph looked up, and Sarah could see all the frustration and insecurity that little boy was carrying. "Professor Sarah," Steph said, his little voice breaking slightly, "why do I have to be the smallest of everyone? The other boys say I'll never be able to play basketball for real because I'm too small. Maybe they're right." Something that touches deeply is how Sarah didn't immediately respond with empty motivational cliches or ready-made phrases that adults usually use with children. Instead, she knelt on the floor to be exactly at Steph's eye level, as if that conversation were the most important thing of her day. "Steph," Sarah finally said, "have you ever heard the story of the acorn that wanted to be an oak tree?" Steph shook his head negatively, his eyes curious despite the sadness. "Once upon a time, there was a very small acorn that fell from a giant tree," Sarah began, using that special voice that elementary teachers reserve for stories that will plant important seeds. All the other seeds laughed at her and said, "You're too small to become a big tree." Do you know what the little acorn did? "What?" Steph asked, already completely involved in the story. "She decided she was going to prove that size doesn't determine destiny. So she buried herself deep in the earth, drank lots of water, always looked for sunlight, and grew slowly, but with great determination. And today," Sarah said, pointing through the window to a giant oak in the schoolyard, "she is the strongest and most beautiful tree in our entire yard." Naturally, this leads us to understand why that metaphor would become a life philosophy for Steph. It wasn't just a story to console him. It was a new way of seeing himself and his future possibilities. "But Professor," Steph protested with the implacable logic of an 8-year-old child, "I'm not an acorn. I'm a person, and small people can't play basketball." Sarah smiled with that type of smile that special educators use when they're about to share a lesson that can change a life forever. "Steph, let me tell you a secret I learned in 20 years working with children. Dreams have no size when you have someone who believes in you. And I believe in you." "But how can you believe in me if I'm the smallest in the class?" Steph asked, his childish curiosity fighting against years of low self-esteem. "Because I see things that others don't see," Sarah replied, gently touching Steph's chest at heart level. "I see fire in here, a special fire that burns stronger than your body size. This fire is called determination, and it's more powerful than height, Steph." What's most impressive is how Sarah had identified exactly the quality that would make Steph special years later. She had seen the intensity of his passion for basketball and understood that this intensity, properly nurtured, could compensate for any physical disadvantage. From that day on, something fundamentally changed in the dynamic between teacher and student. Sarah created the Big Dreams, Bigger Hearts project, a special hour after classes where she worked with Steph and 3 other children in the class who were facing self-esteem challenges. The project wasn't just about basketball, Steph remembered. Professor Sarah taught us about famous people who overcame disadvantages. Michael Jordan being cut from the high school team, Albert Einstein being considered slow as a child, Mozart being rejected by musicians of the time. Have you ever wondered how some teachers manage to transform historical lessons into mirrors where children can see their own possibilities reflected? Sarah Mitchell possessed this rare ability to connect great stories of overcoming with small daily struggles of her students. During those special sessions, Sarah did visualization exercises with the children. "Close your eyes and imagine yourselves achieving your dreams," she would say. "How do you feel? What do you see? Who is cheering for you?" It was a primitive but effective form of positive mental programming decades before such concepts became mainstream. "She made me draw how I would be when I was an NBA player," Steph recalled. "I would draw a small stick figure, but she always corrected, 'Steph, draw yourself scoring points, winning games, being applauded. Size doesn't matter in your drawing because it doesn't matter in your dreams.'" Something that touches deeply is how Sarah not only encouraged Steph with words, but created practical exercises that reprogrammed his self-image. She was systematically replacing limiting narratives with empowering narratives in the mind of an 8-year-old child. "Professor Sarah started giving me special responsibilities in the classroom," Steph remembered. "I helped distribute materials, led reading groups, explained math problems to classmates. She was teaching me to be a leader, even though I was small." During the summer of 1997, Sarah did something extraordinary. She offered free tutoring classes for Steph, but the sessions always ended with conversations about mindset, about how to develop confidence, about the importance of transforming mockery into motivation. "I remember a specific conversation that changed my life," Steph said. "I had cried because some older boys laughed at me on the playground. Professor Sarah told me, 'Steph, when someone laughs at your dreams, it's not because your dreams are too small. It's because they're too big for their imagination.'" How is it possible that phrases said by an elementary teacher become mantras that guide an entire career? Sarah was planting not only confidence, but a complete philosophy about how to deal with external skepticism and doubts. "She created a victory diary for me," Steph recalled. "Every day I had to write one good thing that had happened, no matter how small. I made a basket at recess. I helped a classmate with math. I didn't cry when they laughed at me." It was daily training in focusing on the positive. Naturally, this leads us to understand how Sarah was systematically building emotional resilience in Steph. Each small exercise, each conversation, each project was designed to create mental toughness and unshakable self-esteem. What's most impressive is how Sarah perfectly balanced encouragement with realism. She never promised Steph that it would be easy, never guaranteed that success was assured. Instead, she focused on developing the mental qualities that would be necessary to overcome inevitable obstacles. I remember her telling me, "Steph, small people who achieve big things are special, not despite their size, but because their size forces them to develop qualities that bigger people never need to develop. You're going to be faster, smarter, more determined than big players." You can see that Sarah was completely reframing Steph's physical disadvantage, transforming it into an eventual competitive advantage. It was psychological jujitsu, using the force of opposition to create strength. But then, in 2010, everything changed drastically. The economic crisis and educational reforms hit Charlotte's school system hard. Massive budget cuts led to the elimination of special programs and dismissal of more experienced, and therefore more expensive, teachers, including Sarah Mitchell. "I remember the day she told us she was being dismissed," Steph said. his voice still loaded with emotion even years later. She gathered us. I was already in high school, but I came back to elementary school specifically to say goodbye. She said that regardless of what happened in our lives, we should never forget that we were capable of extraordinary things. Sarah's departure from formal education happened exactly when Steph was beginning to show real promise as a player. He had grown during high school years, his skills were developing, but more importantly, the mindset that Sarah had planted was beginning to flourish. I wanted her to see my progress, Steph confessed. I wanted her to know that the seeds she planted were growing. But then we lost contact. Phone changes, addresses, emails. It was as if she had vanished from my life just when I was becoming the person she said I could be. Something that touches deeply is realizing how frequently we lose touch with people who were fundamental in forming who we become. Steph had left for Davidson College, then for the NBA, building a legendary career. Sarah had faced health issues, financial difficulties, and eventually the loss of her home. During all these years in the NBA, Steph reflected, I carried Professor Sarah's lessons with me. Every time I faced adversity, every time someone said I was too small, I heard her voice reminding me that dreams have no size when you have someone who believes. She became a permanent part of my inner voice. During his most important achievements, MVPs, championships, records, Steph always remembered that third-grade classroom where a special teacher had planted the first seeds of self-belief in a child that the world considered too small for big dreams. What's most impressive is discovering that the first teachers who impact us often have no idea of the real reach of their influence. Sarah Mitchell had planted seeds that flourished into a Hall of Fame career, but she herself hadn't been able to harvest the fruits of her own investments in education. Now, that night after the reunion on Trade Street, Steph finally understood that the moment had come to adequately reciprocate. Sarah Mitchell had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. She had invested time, energy, and love in a small child with enormous dreams. And now, decades later, Steph had the opportunity to show that those investments had generated extraordinary returns. But the question wasn't simply giving money to a teacher in difficulties. It was about restoring dignity to a woman who had dedicated her life to elevating others, about creating an opportunity that honored both her present need and her past contributions. And it was exactly that which Steph began to plan on that sleepless night. Steph spent the entire night awake, walking through the corridors of his house in Atherton, California, with his mind bubbling with memories from third grade and ambitious plans that were taking shape. You can see that there are moments in life where sleeping becomes impossible, not from anxiety, but from a clarity so intense about what we need to do that every fiber of our being vibrates with purpose. At 4 in the morning, he gently woke Isha, knowing he needed to share not only what had happened, but the extraordinary plans that were being born in his mind. "Babe," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed, "I need to tell you about a woman who changed my life when I was 8 years old, and how I'm going to change her life now." Isha sat up immediately, recognizing by the intensity in her husband's voice that something profound had happened. In their years of marriage, she had learned to distinguish between Steph's different emotional tones, and that was the tone of someone who had been touched to the core of his soul. Steph told about Sarah Mitchell, about the reunion on Trade Street, about all the elementary school memories that had returned like an emotional avalanche. Isha listened in silence, holding her husband's hand, feeling the reverence with which he spoke about his first teacher. "I can't simply give her money and move on," Steph said, when he finished telling the story. It would be an offense to her dignity. Professor Sarah was always about planting seeds, about teaching children to believe in themselves. She needs to return to doing what she was born to do: educate small children who need to discover that their dreams have no size. How is it possible that some people have the emotional wisdom to instinctively understand that true restoration goes far beyond financial assistance? Steph had understood that Sarah Mitchell needed not only stability, but renewed purpose, a chance to return to the vocation that defined her essence. "What are you thinking?" Isha asked, already knowing that her husband had spent hours developing some extraordinary plan. "I want to create an educational center for children in vulnerable situations," Steph said, his eyes shining with the excitement of a vision that was crystallizing. Focused specifically on children from 6 to 10 years old who face challenges, whether bullying, low self-esteem, difficult socioeconomic situations, or simply the need for someone who believes in them. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Steph wasn't motivated only by personal gratitude, but by a deep understanding of how early intervention can transform entire life trajectories. He wanted to multiply the impact that Sarah had had on him for hundreds of other children. "And I want Sarah Mitchell to be the pedagogical director," Steph continued. "I want to give her all the resources she never had as a public school teacher: unlimited budget for materials, qualified assistants, classrooms designed specifically to nurture young dreams." Something that touches deeply is how Steph was structuring not only a solution for Sarah's immediate problem, but creating a living legacy of the educational philosophies she had taught him. It was as if he were building a monument to the power of believing in small children with big dreams. In the following hours, Steph began making calls. First to Thomas Anderson, executive director of his Eat, Learn, Play Foundation. Then to Rebecca White, his consultant specialized in early childhood educational projects. And finally to Gregory Taylor, his attorney specialized in philanthropic issues and educational initiatives. "I have a vision," Steph said during a conference call at 7 in the morning. "The Sarah Mitchell Early Education Center, a state-of-the-art facility focused on identifying and nurturing potential in small children that society might overlook. And I want it functioning in Charlotte within 3 months." What's most impressive is how Steph had decided to use all his influence and network to accelerate a process that normally would take years. He began contacting educational experts, child psychologists, architects specialized in learning environments, and other NBA players with foundations focused on education. "Steph," Rebecca said during the call, "creating an educational center from scratch normally takes 18 to 24 months. Regulatory approvals, construction, hiring qualified staff. Then we'll do it in 3 months," Steph interrupted, with the same determination he used for fourth-quarter comebacks. "I have the resources, you have the expertise, and there's a 67-year-old woman living on the streets who needs to return to doing what she loves: educating children." During the next 5 days, Steph worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He identified a beautiful property in Charlotte, a former community center that could be renovated rapidly. He structured a program that would initially serve 100 children from low-income families, with focus on academic development, emotional intelligence, and self-esteem building. The program would be called Dreams Have No Size Initiative, Steph explained to Nicholas White, who was helping with legal aspects. Small classes of no more than 12 children, with focus on personalized attention. Art therapy, confidence-building exercises, tutoring, and most importantly, daily affirmations that help children believe in themselves. Have you ever wondered what it must feel like to be able to transform a childhood memory into institutional reality in a matter of days? For Steph, those days of intensive planning were among the most fulfilling of his entire career, because he could finally use his success to directly honor the person who had planted his first dream. But there was an emotionally complex challenge: how to approach Sarah Mitchell in a way that preserved her dignity and didn't make her feel like an object of charity. Steph knew that the wrong approach could result in rejection, and that Sarah had all the pride necessary to refuse help if it were offered inadequately. "I can't simply appear and say, 'I created a job for you,'" Steph confessed to Jonathan Harris, his personal counselor, who helped him with pressure and life decisions. She would know immediately that it was something created specifically for her, and that might affect her self-worth. Then you need to present it as a legitimate opportunity where she would genuinely be the best person for the position, Jonathan suggested. And technically, it would be true. Who better than a teacher with 40 years of experience who already demonstrated the capacity to transform young lives? Something that touches deeply is how Steph was navigating not just the practical aspects of creating an opportunity, but also the psychological complexities of preserving dignity of someone in a vulnerable situation. It was a masterclass in how to help people in a way that empowers instead of diminishes. Steph decided that the approach would be to present the center as something that was already in development, and that through coincidence, he had remembered Sarah's exceptional qualifications for the position. It would be technically true. The center really was being developed rapidly, and Sarah really had the ideal qualifications. "I'll say that we were looking for someone with specific experience in nurturing young children who face challenges," Steph planned. "Someone who understands that confidence building is just as important as academic learning, and that, when I saw her, I immediately thought she would be perfect for what we're trying to build." On Friday afternoon, Steph was in his car on the way to Charlotte, with a complete presentation about the Sarah Mitchell Early Education Center, detailed job description, and a formal employment offer. But more important than any document was the conversation he had mentally prepared, a conversation that honored the past, addressed the present, and offered a future full of purpose and dignity. "Professor Sarah taught me that dreams have no size when you have someone who believes," Steph murmured to himself while driving through familiar Charlotte streets. "Today, I want to be that person who believes in you." The facility he had chosen was perfect. A beautiful building with large windows, playground space, and rooms that could be converted into classrooms designed specifically for young learners. He had already approved renovations that would create an environment where small children could feel safe, valued, and empowered. The salary would be $95,000 annually, Steph had decided, with full health benefits, housing assistance, and, most importantly, complete autonomy to develop curriculum and hire assistant teachers, plus an operating budget that allows her to create exactly the type of program she always dreamed of having. Naturally, this leads us to the crucial moment where decades of gratitude transform into concrete action, where memories become opportunities, and where a second chance presents itself for two people whose lives had been profoundly intertwined during those formative elementary school years. When Steph arrived at Trade Street at 2 in the afternoon, Sarah Mitchell was there, sitting in the same spot. But this time she had clearly made an effort. She was wearing her cleanest dress, had arranged her hair as best as possible, and Steph could see that despite her circumstances, she had maintained that natural dignity that characterized truly great educators. "Professor Sarah," Steph said, approaching with a genuine smile, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I brought some documents that I think you'll find very interesting." And what happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest gifts we can give are not things, but opportunities, chances for people to return to what they were meant to do. chances for dignity to be restored through purpose rather than charity. Steph arrived at the corner of West Trade Street at exactly 2 in the afternoon, carrying not only a folder with documents, but also 26 years of gratitude that would finally find their adequate expression. You can see that some moments in life carry such intense emotional density that even the air around seems to vibrate with transformative possibilities. Sarah Mitchell was there, exactly as promised, but this time there was something different in her posture. She had managed to wash and comb her hair the best way possible, was wearing her least worn dress, and Steph could see that the teacher had made a real effort to present herself with the dignity that had always characterized her educational career. "Professor Sarah," Steph said, approaching with a smile that radiated both nervousness and excitement. "Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. I brought coffee and some documents that I believe will very much interest you." Steph extended a cup of hot coffee and a small bag with a blueberry muffin. He had remembered that Sarah always brought homemade muffins to share with students who came without snacks. The simple but thoughtful gesture immediately established a tone of mutual respect and genuine consideration. "Steph, you didn't need to," Sarah said, but accepted the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Not from nervousness, but from deep emotion at being treated with kindness after months of social invisibility. How is it possible that a gesture as simple as offering coffee can immediately restore the feeling of humanity and dignity in a person? Steph had intuitively understood that the way he began that conversation would determine not only its outcome, but how Sarah would feel about herself throughout the entire process. "Professor," Steph began, sitting next to Sarah on a small bench nearby, "I have a proposal to make to you. But first, I want you to know that this has nothing to do with pity or charity. It has to do with exceptional qualifications and an opportunity that was made for someone exactly like you." Sarah looked at Steph with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Years living on the streets had taught her to be skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true, but there was something in the sincerity of Steph's eyes that kept her listening intently. "My foundation is launching a revolutionary educational project in Charlotte," Steph continued, opening the folder and removing beautiful renderings of what would be the Sarah Mitchell Early Education Center. "It's focused on children from 6 to 10 years old who need someone who believes in them, small children with big dreams that the world sometimes overlooks." Something that touches deeply is how Steph was presenting a completely real and necessary opportunity. The center genuinely existed, the needs were authentic, and the necessary qualifications were exactly those that Sarah possessed after 4 decades dedicated to elementary education. "The qualifications we're looking for," Steph said, reading from a carefully prepared job description, "include extensive experience in elementary education, proven track record of building self-esteem in young children, ability to develop curriculum that integrates academic learning with emotional development, and, this is crucial, someone who understands that every child has unlimited potential regardless of their current circumstances." Sarah listened in silence, but Steph could see that familiar spark beginning to ignite in the teacher's eyes, the same spark he had seen decades before when Sarah talked about education and human potential. "Steph," Sarah said slowly, "this sounds like an incredible position. But why would you think of me? I haven't worked formally in years. I don't have updated references. I don't have—" "Professor Sarah," Steph interrupted gently, "let me ask you a question. How many students did you inspire during your career? How many children left your classroom believing in themselves in ways they didn't when they first walked in?" Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have someone articulate the value of your life's work in a way that you yourself had forgotten? Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as Steph continued. I remember every single lesson you taught me, Steph said, his voice loaded with genuine emotion. Not just about reading and math, but about life. You taught me that dreams have no size when you have someone who believes. That being small means you have to develop qualities that bigger people never need to develop. That confidence is built one small victory at a time. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when the circle completes itself, when the student who was elevated has the chance to elevate his teacher, when gratitude finds its perfect expression through real opportunity and restored purpose. Professor, Steph continued, retrieving an elegant envelope from the folder, this is a formal job offer. Pedagogical Director of the Sarah Mitchell Early Education Center. Salary of $95,000 annually. Full health benefits, housing assistance while you get established, and most importantly, complete autonomy to create exactly the type of program you always dreamed of having. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands and read the contents in silence. Steph could see decades of struggle and disappointment being replaced by something he hadn't seen on her face since those days at Oaklawn Elementary. Hope, purpose, and the kind of excitement that only true educators feel when presented with a chance to impact young lives. Steph, Sarah said, her voice breaking, I don't know what to say. Do you really believe that I still have something to offer? After everything that happened? After where life took me? What's most impressive is how Sarah, even receiving a lifeline, was still questioning her own value. A testament to how profoundly circumstances can affect our self-perception, even when our core capabilities remain unchanged. Professor Sarah, Steph said, placing a gentle hand on the older woman's shoulder. Let me tell you something. Last night, I called several colleagues in the NBA who have educational programs. I told them about a teacher who once told me that dreams have no size when you have someone who believes, and how those words changed my entire life. Steph paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Do you know what all of them said? That they desperately needed educators who understood how to identify and nurture potential in young children that society might write off. You're not just qualified for this position. You're exactly what these kids need. Something that touches deeply is realizing that Steph wasn't offering charity. He was offering Sarah a chance to return to her calling, to do what she had always been meant to do, to impact lives in the same profound way that only truly gifted early childhood educators can. Sarah remained in silence for several minutes, holding the documents, processing not just the logistics of the offer, but the emotional magnitude of having her life's work validated and restored in such a beautiful way. Steph, she finally said, do you remember what I always said about teaching young children? Teaching is planting seeds in gardens you may never see bloom, Steph responded immediately, the phrase returning to him as if it had been said yesterday. Exactly, Sarah said, and for the first time since Steph had found her, the teacher smiled with that radiant smile that had inspired countless children throughout her career. I planted seeds in you, and now you're giving me the chance to plant seeds in a whole new generation. You can see that in that moment, both Steph and Sarah understood that this was much more than a job offer or a rescue mission. It was the completion of a circle that had begun in an elementary classroom years earlier, a testament to the enduring power of education, mentorship, and human connection. I accept, Sarah said, extending her hand to Steph, but with one condition. Steph raised his eyebrows, curious. I want you to come speak with the children regularly, Sarah said. Not as a celebrity, making appearances, but as someone who lived the lessons we'll be teaching. These kids need to see that dreams really don't have size limits. Naturally, this leads us to the understanding that Sarah, even in a position of vulnerability, was still thinking like an educator, considering what would be best for the students, how to maximize the impact of the program, how to create the most meaningful learning experiences possible. 4 months later, the Sarah Mitchell Early Education Center was functioning at full capacity in a gorgeous facility in Charlotte. 100 young children, most of them facing challenges similar to those Steph had faced, were receiving not only academic support, but emotional nurturing, confidence building, and, most importantly, the kind of belief in their potential that can literally transform life trajectories. Sarah had found her way back not just to stability, but to pure joy. She had a comfortable apartment, colleagues who respected her, and most importantly, a daily reminder that her life's work had profound meaning and continuing impact. Do you know what's the most rewarding part of this program? Sarah asked during a phone conversation with Steph some months after the grand opening. What's that, Professor? Watching these children discover that they're capable of much more than they ever imagined, Sarah said. It's exactly the same expression you had on your face when you finally realized that you were going to make it. That moment when self-doubt transforms into self-belief. There's nothing in the world like it. Something that touches deeply is discovering that when we help restore someone's purpose, we don't just change their life. We multiply the impact they can have on countless others. Sarah wasn't just being helped. She was being empowered to help others in the same profound way she had helped Steph. During a visit to the center, Steph observed Sarah working with a little girl named Emma, a 7-year-old child who was being bullied because she was smaller than her classmates and dreamed of becoming a professional soccer player. Emma, Sarah was saying, kneeling down to eye level just as she had done with Steph years ago. Let me tell you about a little acorn that wanted to become a giant tree. And Steph smiled, realizing that the circle was not just complete. It was expanding. Sarah was now planting seeds in Emma that would hopefully bloom decades later, just as the seeds she had planted in him had bloomed into this moment of restoration and multiplication. Professor Sarah, Steph said during their final conversation for this story, thank you for teaching me that dreams have no size. And thank you for letting me prove to you that circumstances also don't define destiny. Steph, Sarah replied, her voice full of that warmth and wisdom that had originally inspired a scrawny 8-year-old to believe in impossible dreams. You didn't just prove it to me. You're helping me prove it to a whole new generation of children who need to hear it just as much as you did. What's most impressive is how this story demonstrates that the most powerful form of gratitude isn't expressed in words, but in actions that honor the original gift by multiplying its impact exponentially. Steph didn't just thank Sarah Mitchell. He created a way for Sarah to continue being the teacher and mentor she had always been meant to be. Today, when people ask Steph about the most important shot he ever made, he doesn't talk about NBA Finals or Olympic Games. He talks about an afternoon on Trade Street when he chose to transform gratitude into opportunity, when he proved that sometimes the most important victories happen off the court, and when he demonstrated that true greatness is measured not by what we achieve, but by how we use our achievements to elevate those who helped us reach where we are.